What if I told you that the language you speak, the food you eat, and even the money in your pocket were all shaped by an empire that once ruled vast territories across the globe? For over 500 years, the Spanish Empire left an indelible mark on history, influencing cultures, economies, and societies in ways we often overlook. But how did this empire rise to such power, and what ultimately led to its downfall? In this documentary, we'll bring to life the people and events that shaped the Spanish Empire. Get ready to see history like never before. It's 1469, and two young royals, Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, are about to tie the knot. This wasn't just any royal wedding. It was a strategic alliance that would unite two of the most powerful kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula. At the time, Spain as we know it today didn't exist. Instead, the peninsula was a patchwork of different kingdoms, each with its own laws and customs. Isabella and Ferdinand's marriage was like putting together two pieces of a puzzle. Castile was the larger kingdom with more land and people, while Aragon had a strong presence in the Mediterranean. Together, they created a powerhouse that would soon dominate European politics. But it wasn't all smooth sailing at first. Castile and Aragon kept their separate laws and governments. It was more like a partnership than a full merger. The newlyweds had big plans for their kingdoms. They wanted to create a strong centralized monarchy and reduce the power of the nobles who had been calling the shots for too long. They set about improving how things were run, making tax collection more efficient, and building up their military might. It was like they were giving their kingdoms a major upgrade. One of the clever moves Isabella and Ferdinand made was to get the Pope on their side. They received the title Los Reyes Católicos, or the Catholic Monarchs, which was a big deal back then. This title wasn't just for show. It meant that they had the backing of the Church, which was hugely important in medieval Europe. They used their Catholic faith as a way to bring their people together, creating a sense of unity that hadn't existed before. With their newfound power and unity, Isabella and Ferdinand started looking beyond their borders. They set their sights on the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa and strengthened Spain's position in the Mediterranean. It was like they were testing the waters for the big expansions that would come later. The marriage of Isabella and Ferdinand was more than just a union of two people. It was the birth of a new power on the world stage. They laid the groundwork for Spain to become one of the most powerful empires in history. Their policies and decisions would shape not just Spain, but the entire world for centuries to come. The Catholic monarchs had united Spain through marriage, but their ambitions stretched far beyond the borders of their newly formed kingdom. In 1492, a pivotal event would set the stage for Spain's transformation from a regional power to a global empire. The fall of Granada marked the end of the Reconquista, a centuries-long campaign by Christian kingdoms to reclaim Iberian territories from Muslim rule. This wasn't just any military victory. It was the culmination of a dream that had driven Spanish rulers for generations. The Reconquista had been going on for nearly 800 years ever since Muslim forces first conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula in 711. Over the centuries, Christian kingdoms in the north slowly pushed southward, reclaiming land bit by bit. By the late 15th century, only one Muslim stronghold remained, the Emirate of Granada. Isabella and Ferdinand saw the conquest of Granada as their divine mission. In 1482, they launched a final military campaign against the Nasrid rulers of Granada. This wasn't just a simple battle. It was a decade-long siege that combined military might with clever diplomacy and economic pressure. The Catholic monarchs employed superior artillery and used their resources to slowly strangle Granada's economy. The siege wasn't without its challenges. The mountainous terrain around Granada made it a natural fortress, and the Muslim defenders fought fiercely to protect their last foothold in Iberia. But Isabella and Ferdinand were persistent. They built a whole new city called Santa Fe, or Holy Faith, right outside Granada's walls. This wasn't just a military camp. It was a statement of their intention to stay until victory was achieved. As the siege dragged on, internal divisions weakened Granada's resolve. The last Muslim ruler, Boabdil, found himself caught between his own people's desire to fight on and the reality of their dwindling resources. On January 2, 1492, after 10 years of struggle, Boabdil surrendered the keys of the Alhambra Palace to the Catholic monarchs. The fall of Granada was more than just a military victory. It was a symbolic triumph that resonated throughout Europe. The Pope celebrated the news, and other Christian rulers sent congratulations. For Isabella and Ferdinand, it was the fulfillment of a long-held dream to unite all of Spain under Christian rule. But what about the Muslim population of Granada? Initially, the Treaty of Granada promised religious and cultural protections for the city's inhabitants. Muslims were allowed to keep their mosques, practice their faith, and maintain their customs. However, these promises would prove short-lived. As Spain pursued a policy of religious uniformity, these protections were gradually eroded and eventually revoked entirely. The conquest of Granada had far-reaching consequences. It freed up significant resources that had been tied up in the long campaign. The newfound wealth and stability allowed Isabella and Ferdinand to turn their attention to other matters, including overseas exploration. The fall of Granada marked a turning point for Spain, but it also set the stage for a series of decisions that would reshape the entire world. While the Catholic monarchs celebrated their victory over the last Muslim stronghold, in Iberia they were already planning their next move. The resources and momentum gained from the Reconquista would soon be directed towards a new goal, one that would have far-reaching consequences for millions of people across Spain and beyond. In 1492, just months after the fall of Granada, Isabella and Ferdinand made a momentous decision. They issued the Alhambra Decree, which ordered all Jews in Spain to either convert to Christianity or leave the kingdom within 4 months. This edict, also known as the Edict of Expulsion, came as a shock to many. The Jewish community had been an integral part of Spanish society for centuries, contributing to its culture, economy, and intellectual life. The expulsion was not a sudden decision, but the culmination of years of growing anti-Semitism in Spain. The Catholic monarchs saw religious unity as essential for building a strong, centralized state. They believed that the presence of non-Christians, particularly Jews, posed a threat to this vision. The impact of the Alhambra Decree was immediate and devastating. An estimated 200,000 Jews were forced into exile. Many fled to neighboring Portugal, only to face expulsion from there a few years later. Others found refuge in North Africa, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire. The Sephardic diaspora, as it came to be known, spread Spanish Jewish culture, language, and traditions across the Mediterranean and beyond. Those who chose to stay and convert, known as conversos, faced ongoing suspicion and persecution. The Inquisition intensified its efforts to root out crypto-Jews, those who allegedly maintained Jewish practices in secret. This climate of fear and mistrust would persist for generations, affecting Spanish society in profound ways. The expulsion of the Jews was followed by similar measures against Muslims. In 1502, Isabella and Ferdinand issued a decree requiring all Muslims in Castile to either convert to Christianity or leave. Unlike the Jewish expulsion, this edict wasn't immediately enforced on a large scale. Many Muslims, known as mudejars, initially remained in Spain, converting under pressure to become Moriscos. However, the situation for Moriscos gradually deteriorated. They faced increasing restrictions on their cultural practices and were often viewed with suspicion by their Christian neighbors. The fear of a potential Muslim uprising led to stricter policies, and eventually, in 1609 under Philip III, all Moriscos were expelled from Spain. This final expulsion affected an estimated 300,000 people, many of whom had lived in Spain for generations. The expulsions had significant economic consequences for Spain. Jews and Muslims had played crucial roles in trade, finance, and skilled crafts. Cities like Toledo, Seville, and Valencia, which had thrived on the talents and networks of these communities, saw their economies suffer. The loss of skilled artisans, merchants, and intellectuals created gaps that were not easily filled. Moreover, the expulsions reinforced Spain's identity as a strictly Catholic nation. This religious exclusivity would shape Spanish policy both at home and in its expanding empire. As Spain began to establish colonies in the Americas and elsewhere, it carried this model of religious uniformity with it, influencing the way it approached indigenous populations and setting the stage for future conflicts. As the Catholic monarchs celebrated their newly forged kingdom, a daring explorer was about to change the course of history. In 1492, the same year as the fall of Granada and the expulsion of the Jews, Christopher Columbus set sail on a voyage that would reshape the world. Columbus, a skilled navigator from Genoa, Italy, had a bold idea. He believed he could reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean. This wasn't a new concept, but Columbus's calculations of the Earth's size were way off. He thought the journey would be much shorter than it actually was. Luckily for him, Isabella and Ferdinand decided to fund his expedition. They saw it as a chance to expand Spain's influence and find new trade routes. On August 3, 1492, Columbus set off from Spain with 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. The journey was long and difficult. The crew grew restless as days turned into weeks with no sight of land. Just when mutiny seemed likely, on October 12, 1492, a sailor spotted land. Columbus had reached the Bahamas, an island chain in the Caribbean. He thought he had made it to the outskirts of Asia. Little did he know, he'd stumbled upon a whole new world, to Europeans at least. Over the next 12 years, Columbus made 4 voyages to the Americas. He explored parts of the Caribbean, including Cuba, Hispaniola, or modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica. He even touched the coasts of Central and South America. Each time, he returned to Spain with tales of new lands, exotic peoples, and the promise of riches. But Columbus's voyages weren't just about exploration. They marked the beginning of European colonization in the Americas. The Spanish quickly established settlements on the islands Columbus visited. They saw these new lands as a source of wealth and an opportunity to spread Christianity. This set off a chain of events that would have profound consequences for both the Old and New Worlds. Columbus's encounters with indigenous peoples like the Taíno had devastating effects. European diseases like smallpox spread rapidly among populations with no immunity. Forced labor and enslavement led to widespread suffering and death. The Columbian Exchange, as historians call it, brought not just people and goods, but also plants, animals, and microbes across the Atlantic. This global transfer would forever alter ecosystems, economies, and societies on both sides of the ocean. While Columbus was hailed as a hero in Spain, his governorship of the new colonies was far from smooth. He faced accusations of mismanagement and cruelty. In 1500, he was arrested and sent back to Spain in chains. Though he was later released and allowed to make more voyages, he never regained his former status. Columbus's expeditions also sparked intense rivalry between Spain and Portugal. Both nations wanted control over newly discovered lands. This led to the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which essentially divided the non-European world between these two powers. Spain got rights to most of the Americas, while Portugal claimed what would become Brazil and the lands to the east. Ironically, Columbus died still believing he had reached Asia. He never realized he'd found a whole new continent. But his voyages had set in motion events that would transform the world. Spain now had a foothold in the Americas, a vast new territory ripe for exploitation and colonization. Columbus's voyages had opened the floodgates of European interest in the Americas. But it was what happened next that truly set the stage for Spain's global dominance. The Spanish conquest of the Caribbean from 1493 to 1510 was a period of rapid expansion and transformation that would shape the future of two continents. It all began with Columbus's second expedition in 1493, which was far larger than his first. This time, he brought 17 ships filled with over 1,000 settlers, soldiers, and priests. They weren't just explorers, they were colonizers, ready to establish a permanent Spanish presence in the New World. The Caribbean quickly became the heart of Spain's growing empire. Its islands served as strategic bases for further exploration and conquest. Spanish navigators spent years mapping the intricate coastlines and treacherous waters of the region. Their detailed charts and maps gave Spain a crucial advantage in navigating these unfamiliar areas. As Spanish control spread across the Caribbean islands, we see the emergence of early colonial towns. These settlements were built in the European style with central plazas, imposing churches, and grand government buildings. It was as if Spain was trying to recreate a little piece of Europe in the tropics. But these towns weren't just for show. They were the centers of Spanish power and culture in the New World. The Catholic Church played a huge role in this early colonization. Priests and missionaries served alongside the settlers and soldiers. They weren't just there to save souls, they were also key players in legitimizing Spanish rule. The church provided education, set up hospitals, and even helped govern these new colonies. It was like the spiritual arm of the Spanish crown reaching across the Atlantic. While the Spanish were busy building their new colonial society, they were also transforming the Caribbean economy. They introduced crops from Europe and Africa, things like wheat, sugarcane, and citrus fruits. These new plants changed the face of Caribbean agriculture. Sugarcane in particular would go on to become a major driver of the colonial economy, creating vast plantations and, sadly, fueling the demand for enslaved labor. By 1510, the Caribbean had become more than just a collection of colonies. It was the springboard for Spain's future conquests. From these island bases, Spanish conquistadors would launch expeditions to Mexico, Central America, and South America. The routes and systems established in the Caribbean would serve as the blueprint for Spain's expanding empire. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The early years of Spanish rule in the Caribbean were marked by fierce competition among Spanish governors and explorers. They fought for power and influence, often at the expense of good governance. This internal rivalry would shape how Spain administered its growing territories, setting patterns that would last for centuries. While Spanish governors fought for control of the islands, their gaze turned westward to the mysterious mainland. Reports of vast empires and untold riches began to circulate, capturing the imagination of ambitious conquistadors. One man in particular would seize this opportunity and forever change the course of history. In 1519, Hernán Cortés, a Spanish conquistador, set sail from Cuba with a small force of about 600 men, 16 horses, and a few cannons. His mission was to explore and conquer the mainland of Mexico. What he didn't know was that he was about to encounter one of the most powerful empires in the Americas, the Aztecs. Cortés and his men landed on the coast of present-day Mexico and began their journey inland. As they traveled, they encountered various indigenous groups, some of whom were hostile to the Aztecs. Cortés quickly realized he could use these local rivalries to his advantage. He formed alliances with groups like the Tlaxcalans, who saw the Spanish as potential allies against their Aztec oppressors. These indigenous allies provided crucial support to Cortés. They offered not just military assistance, but also vital information about Aztec society, their strengths and weaknesses. This knowledge would prove invaluable in the coming conflict. As Cortés and his growing army approached Tenochtitlan, the magnificent capital of the Aztec Empire, they were met with an awe-inspiring sight. The city, built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, was a marvel of engineering and urban planning. It was larger and more impressive than any European city of the time, with grand temples, towering pyramids, and a complex system of canals. The Spanish were greeted by Emperor Moctezuma II, who was unsure whether these strange newcomers were gods or mere mortals. This uncertainty would prove fatal for the Aztecs. Cortés, taking advantage of the situation, took Moctezuma hostage, using him as a political tool to control the empire. For a time, it seemed the Spanish had achieved a bloodless conquest, but tensions soon escalated. In 1520, during a religious festival at the Templo Mayor, Spanish soldiers massacred unarmed Aztec nobles. This act of brutality sparked a fierce uprising. The Spanish found themselves under siege, forced to fight their way out of the city in a desperate retreat known as La Noche Triste, or the Night of Sorrows. But Cortés was not one to give up easily. He regrouped with his indigenous allies and launched a counterattack. The Spanish lay siege to Tenochtitlan, cutting off its food and water supplies. They used their superior weaponry, including cannons and crossbows, to devastating effect. The Aztecs fought bravely, but they were no match for Spanish military technology and tactics. The siege of Tenochtitlan lasted for months. The Aztecs, weakened by hunger and disease, continued to resist. But on August 13, 1521, the city finally fell. The Aztec Empire, which had dominated central Mexico for centuries, collapsed in just 2 years. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked a turning point in the history of the Americas. Cortés ordered the ruins of the Aztec capital to be demolished, and on its ashes, he began construction of a new city, Mexico City. This would become the capital of New Spain, the first major Spanish colony on the American mainland. The conquest of the Aztecs opened the floodgates for further Spanish expansion. It provided a template for future conquests, demonstrating how a small force, armed with superior technology and clever diplomacy, could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The indigenous population of Mexico was devastated, not just by warfare, but by European diseases to which they had no immunity. The rich and complex Aztec culture was systematically dismantled and replaced by Spanish institutions and the Catholic Church. The conquest of the Aztecs had revealed a formula for success, but the Spanish appetite for gold and glory was far from satisfied. As news of Cortés's triumph spread, another ambitious conquistador set his sights on an even greater prize, the fabled Inca Empire of South America. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro arrived on the western coast of South America with a small force of fewer than 200 men. The timing of his expedition was fortuitous. The Inca Empire, which stretched along the Andes Mountains from modern-day Ecuador to Chile, was in the throes of a brutal civil war. Two brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar, were locked in a fierce struggle for the imperial throne, leaving the empire vulnerable to outside forces. Pizarro, like Cortés before him, quickly recognized the opportunity presented by these internal divisions. He marched inland, gathering intelligence about the Inca state and forming alliances with indigenous groups who resented Inca rule. As he moved deeper into Inca territory, Pizarro formulated a daring plan that would change the course of South American history. On November 16, 1532, in the highland town of Cajamarca, Pizarro sprang his trap. He lured the Inca ruler Atahualpa into a meeting, ostensibly to welcome him as a fellow monarch. But as Atahualpa entered the town square with thousands of unarmed attendants, the Spanish unleashed a surprise attack. In a matter of hours, Pizarro's tiny force had captured the Inca Empire and slaughtered thousands of his followers. The capture of Atahualpa threw the Inca Empire into chaos. In a desperate bid for freedom, the emperor offered to fill a room with gold and silver as a ransom. The Spanish accepted this incredible offer, amassing a treasure trove that would be worth billions in today's currency. But even this vast wealth couldn't save Atahualpa. In 1533, after extracting all the information and resources they could from their royal captive, the Spanish executed him, effectively decapitating the Inca state. With the central authority of the empire eliminated, Pizarro and his men marched on Cuzco, the Inca capital. The city, weakened by civil war and the loss of its leader, quickly fell to the Spanish invaders. Pizarro installed a puppet ruler and began the process of dismantling the Inca state, just as Cortés had done with the Aztecs. The conquest of the Inca Empire was not solely a military achievement. Like the fall of the Aztecs, it was aided by a combination of factors. The Spanish exploited existing political divisions, forged alliances with disaffected groups within the empire, and brought devastating European diseases that ravaged the indigenous population. The Inca, with no immunity to these new pathogens, saw their numbers plummet, further weakening their ability to resist the invaders. In 1535, Pizarro founded the city of Lima, which would become the administrative capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru. This new political entity consolidated Spanish rule over much of South America, creating a vast colonial territory that would fuel Spain's growing empire for centuries to come. However, the fall of Cuzco didn't mark the immediate end of Inca resistance. Manco Inca, a puppet ruler who had initially cooperated with the Spanish, managed to escape and establish a rebel state in the remote fortress of Vilcabamba. From this stronghold, the last remnants of the Inca state continued to resist Spanish rule until 1572, when the final Inca ruler was captured and executed. As the dust settled on the conquest of the Inca state, Spain faced a new challenge: how to govern its rapidly expanding territories in the New World. The fall of Cuzco in 1533 marked a pivotal moment, but it was far from the end of the story. While Pizarro and his men celebrated their victory, the seeds of a new administrative system were already taking root. In 1535, just 2 years after Atahualpa's execution, Spain established the Viceroyalty of New Spain. This vast territory encompassed Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, and even parts of what would become the United States. Mexico City, built on the ruins of the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan, became the seat of power for this new colonial entity. The creation of the Viceroyalties was a stroke of administrative genius. These large divisions were ruled by viceroys, individuals who represented the Spanish crown and wielded immense power in their territories. They were, in essence, the king's stand-ins, tasked with overseeing everything from taxation and military defense to religious conversion and the implementation of royal decrees. But Spain's ambitions didn't stop at New Spain. In 1542, the Viceroyalty of Peru was established, encompassing all of Spain's South American territories. Lima, founded by Pizarro himself, became the administrative center of this new viceroyalty. From the Pacific coast to the Andean highlands, Spanish authority now stretched across a continent. The viceroys were more than just colonial governors. They were the embodiment of royal authority in lands thousands of miles from Madrid. These men, often from noble families, were expected to rule with an iron fist, while also navigating the complex social and political landscapes of their new domains. To ensure that the viceroys didn't become too powerful or independent, Spain created a system of checks and balances. The Council of the Indies, based in Spain, supervised colonial governance from afar. This body acted as a bridge between the New World and the Spanish monarchy, ensuring that the interests of the crown were always paramount. Within the viceroyalties themselves, royal audiencias were established. These high courts served a dual purpose. They provided local governance and acted as a check on the viceroy's power. If a viceroy overstepped his bounds or acted against the crown's interests, the audiencia could intervene. The creation of the viceroyalties centralized Spanish control over its vast empire in a way that had never been seen before. It prevented the rise of independent colonial rulers and ensured a steady flow of wealth back to Spain. Gold, silver, and other resources from the Americas were now funneled through a well-organized system, fueling Spain's growing power on the world stage. This administrative structure would prove remarkably durable. For nearly 3 centuries, the viceroyalties would form the backbone of Spanish rule in the Americas. They shaped the governance, culture, and even the geography of Latin America in ways that are still felt today. But while the viceroyalties brought order to Spain's New World possessions, they also created a rigid hierarchy that would eventually contribute to the empire's downfall. The system favored peninsulares, those born in Spain, over criollos, individuals of Spanish descent born in the Americas. This discrimination would sow the seeds of discontent that would eventually bloom into the Latin American independence movements. While Spain's viceroyalties brought order to its vast New World empire, a hidden power was growing beneath the surface, one that would ultimately reshape the entire continent. In 1565, nearly 3 decades after the creation of the Viceroyalty of Peru, Spain established a trade route that would connect its American colonies with Asia, creating one of the longest-lasting and most profitable global trade networks in history. The Manila Galleon trade, as it came to be known, was the brainchild of Miguel López de Legazpi, a Spanish navigator and governor who secured control over the Philippines. This strategic move made Manila the hub of Spain's Asian trade network, opening up a whole new world of possibilities for the empire. Picture massive Spanish galleons, their holds filled with exotic treasures, sailing annually between Manila and Acapulco, Mexico. These ships carried a cornucopia of Asian goods, luxurious silks, delicate porcelain, aromatic spices, and intricately carved ivory. But the real engine of this trade was silver, mined from the depths of Mexico and Peru. This precious metal became the primary currency used to purchase luxury goods from China, creating a dependency that would have far-reaching consequences for the Spanish Empire. The Manila Galleon trade wasn't just about moving goods. It was a catalyst for cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. Asian influences began to seep into the Americas and Europe, changing everything from art and architecture to cuisine and fashion. Imagine the awe of a Mexican artisan encountering Chinese porcelain for the first time, or a Spanish noble savoring the exotic flavors of Southeast Asian spices. But this maritime highway across the Pacific Ocean was far from a leisurely cruise. The journey was long and fraught with danger. Storms could whip up at a moment's notice, turning the peaceful ocean into a watery grave. Pirates lurked in wait, hoping to seize the valuable cargoes. And as other European powers began to flex their naval muscles, Spanish ships had to contend with rival navies seeking to break their monopoly. For 250 years, the Manila Galleons plied their trade, cementing Spain's position as a global maritime power. This vast economic network linked Asia, the Americas, and Europe in ways that would influence world trade for centuries to come. But like all great empires, Spain's dominance wouldn't last forever. In 1815, as Mexico's independence movement gained momentum, the changing tides of global trade patterns finally brought an end to Spain's monopoly over Pacific commerce. The last Manila galleon set sail, marking the end of an era that had lasted for 2.5 centuries. As the last Manila galleon disappeared over the horizon in 1815, it marked more than just the end of a trade route. It signaled a seismic shift in the balance of global power. While Spain's empire was crumbling, a new chapter in the conquest of the Americas was unfolding, one that had begun nearly 3 centuries earlier and would continue for decades to come. The story of Spain's conquest of the Maya kingdoms stands in stark contrast to its rapid victories over the Aztecs and Incas. This was no swift campaign, but a prolonged struggle that lasted almost 200 years. In 1524, Pedro de Alvarado, one of Hernán Cortés's trusted lieutenants, led the first major Spanish invasion into Guatemala. His target? The powerful Quiche Maya, whom he defeated at the Battle of El Pinar. But the Maya were not a unified empire like the Aztecs or Incas. Instead, their civilization was a patchwork of city-states, each fiercely independent. This fragmentation posed a unique challenge for the Spanish conquistadors. They couldn't simply topple a central authority and claim victory. Instead, they had to conquer each kingdom one by one, a task that would prove far more difficult than they initially imagined. The Maya didn't go down without a fight. Leaders like Tecún, who would later become a Guatemalan national hero, stood against the Spanish invaders. These indigenous warriors employed guerrilla tactics, using their knowledge of the dense jungle terrain to their advantage. The Spanish found themselves embroiled in a conflict unlike any they had faced before in the Americas. As the decades wore on, Spain established colonies in Yucatan, Belize, and Honduras. But full control of the Maya territories remained elusive. The jungle swallowed up Spanish expeditions, and Maya resistance continued to flare up across the region. It was a war of attrition, slowly grinding down both sides. The conquest dragged on for generations. Spanish soldiers who first set foot in Maya territory as young men grew old and died, their sons and grandsons continuing the fight. The Maya, too, saw their world change dramatically over the course of this long struggle. Many communities adapted to Spanish rule, finding ways to preserve elements of their traditions while outwardly conforming to the new order. It wasn't until 1697, 173 years after Alvarado's initial invasion, that Spain finally launched its assault on Tayasal, the last independent Maya city. This time, they came not just by land, but also by water, using warships to attack from Lake Petanitza. With the fall of Tayasal, the Spanish could at last claim complete control over the Maya regions. The conquest of the Maya stands as one of the longest and most complex military campaigns in Spanish colonial history. It highlights both the determination of the Spanish Empire to extend its reach and the fierce resistance of indigenous peoples fighting to preserve their way of life. But the story of the Maya under Spanish rule didn't end with military conquest. Unlike the Aztec and Inca civilizations, which saw their power structures completely dismantled, many Maya communities found ways to adapt and survive under colonial rule. They maintained elements of their culture, language, and traditions, even as they outwardly conformed to Spanish authority. As Charles V ascended to the throne in 1516, the Spanish Empire stood on the brink of unprecedented power. This young Habsburg ruler inherited a vast domain that stretched across Europe and into the New World, earning him the title Emperor of Two Worlds. Charles's reign would mark the zenith of Spanish influence, but it also sowed the seeds of future challenges that would shape the empire for generations to come. The sheer scale of Charles's inheritance was staggering. He ruled over Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands, Austria, and the rapidly expanding territories in the Americas. This patchwork of lands made him the most powerful monarch in Europe, but it also presented unique challenges. Charles found himself constantly on the move, traveling between his various domains to maintain control and address local concerns. Throughout his reign, Charles faced a relentless series of conflicts that tested the limits of Spanish power. The Habsburg-Valois Wars pitted him against France in a struggle for dominance in Italy. To the east, the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent threatened Charles's territory in Central Europe and the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, the Protestant Reformation sparked unrest in the Holy Roman Empire, culminating in the Schmalkaldic Wars of 1546 to 1547. Despite these challenges, Charles's reign saw significant expansion of Spanish power in the New World. The conquests of Mexico in 1521 and Peru in 1533 brought vast new territories under Spanish control. These conquests also unleashed a flood of silver and gold that fueled the Spanish economy and financed Charles's ambitious military campaigns. The influx of American wealth transformed Spain into the richest nation in Europe, but it came at a cost. The constant warfare drained the imperial coffers, forcing Charles to rely heavily on taxation and loans from powerful banking families. This financial strain would have long-lasting consequences for the Spanish economy. Charles saw himself as the defender of Catholicism in an increasingly fractured Christian world. He took a hard line against the spread of Protestantism, viewing it as a threat to both his religious beliefs and his political authority. This stance would shape Spanish policy for generations, leading to conflicts that would eventually contribute to the empire's decline. By 1556, after 4 decades of near-constant warfare and travel, Charles was exhausted. In a series of ceremonies, he abdicated his various titles, dividing his empire between his son Philip II and his brother Ferdinand I. Philip inherited Spain, the Americas, and the Netherlands, while Ferdinand received the Holy Roman Empire. This division marked the end of Charles's dream of a universal Christian empire and set the stage for future conflicts between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburg family. Charles spent his final years in a monastery in Spain, a far cry from the bustling courts and battlefields that had defined his reign. He left behind a complex legacy. Under his rule, Spain had reached the height of its power, with an empire that spanned the globe. Yet, the very policies that had brought Spain to this pinnacle, constant warfare, religious intolerance, and financial overextension, contain the seeds of its eventual decline. As the sun set on Charles V's reign, a new chapter in Spanish history was about to unfold. One that would test the limits of its naval prowess and reshape the balance of power in Europe. The year was 1588, and King Philip II, Charles V's son and successor, was about to launch an audacious plan that would either cement Spain's dominance or expose its vulnerabilities. The Spanish Armada, a fleet of unprecedented size and ambition, set sail from Lisbon with a clear mission: to overthrow Queen Elizabeth I of England and restore Catholic rule to the island nation. This wasn't just a military operation. It was a clash of ideologies, religions, and emerging national identities. Philip II had assembled a force of 130 ships, manned by 8,000 sailors and 18,000 soldiers, a floating city of wood and canvas that stretched across the horizon. But why such a massive undertaking? The roots of this conflict ran deep. English privateers, with the tacit approval of Elizabeth I, had been raiding Spanish treasure fleets returning from the Americas. These raids, led by daring captains like Sir Francis Drake, had not only enriched England, but also humiliated Spain. The Armada was Philip's answer to these provocations, a show of force meant to reassert Spain's dominance over the seas. The Spanish plan was intricate. The Armada would sail up the English Channel, link up with Spanish forces in the Netherlands, and then transport this combined army across the narrow strait to invade England. On paper, it seemed foolproof, but as the massive fleet approached the English coast, cracks in the strategy began to appear. The English, led by Lord Howard of Effingham and Sir Francis Drake, employed tactics that exploited the Armada's weaknesses. The smaller, more maneuverable ships harassed the Spanish fleet, picking off stragglers and disrupting formations. In the narrow confines of the Channel, the Spanish found their large galleons unwieldy and vulnerable. Then came a masterstroke of English ingenuity: the use of fire ships. 8 vessels, packed with combustibles, were set aflame and sent drifting into the tightly packed Spanish fleet anchored off Calais. The Spanish captains, fearing explosions, cut their anchor cables and scattered in panic. This chaos prevented the crucial rendezvous with the land forces in the Netherlands, effectively derailing the entire invasion plan. But nature, it seemed, had the final say. As the battered Armada attempted to regroup and return to Spain, a powerful storm in the North Sea, later dubbed the Protestant Wind by Elizabeth I, drove many ships onto the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Of the original 130 ships, only about half made it back to Spanish ports. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was more than just a military setback. It was a pivotal moment in European history. Spain's aura of invincibility was shattered, and the balance of power began to shift. England, once considered a second-rate power, emerged as a serious contender on the world stage. This victory emboldened English ambitions for overseas expansion and set the stage for the rise of the British Empire. For Spain, the failure of the Armada marked the beginning of a long, slow decline. While still a formidable power, cracks were beginning to show in the edifice of Spanish dominance. The enormous cost of the expedition strained Spain's already overextended finances, weakening its ability to project power across its vast empire. As Spain's grip on European dominance began to slip, a new challenge emerged from an unexpected quarter. The Dutch provinces, long under Spanish control, were about to ignite a conflict that would test the limits of Spain's power and reshape the political landscape of Europe. The 80 Years' War, also known as the Dutch Revolt, began in 1568 as a rebellion against the rule of King Philip II of Spain. This wasn't just another regional conflict. It was a struggle that would last for generations and have far-reaching consequences for the Spanish Empire. The roots of the rebellion ran deep. The Dutch provinces, a patchwork of territories in the Low Countries, had enjoyed a degree of autonomy under previous rulers. But Philip II, son of Charles V, sought to tighten Spanish control and impose a centralized government. This political overreach was compounded by religious tensions. Philip, a staunch Catholic, was determined to stamp out Protestantism, which had gained a strong foothold in the Netherlands. The Dutch, fiercely protective of their religious freedoms, saw this as an intolerable infringement on their rights. But it wasn't just about politics and religion. Economic factors played a crucial role in fueling the revolt. Spain's attempt to impose heavy taxation on the prosperous Dutch provinces sparked widespread resentment. The Netherlands had become a hub of trade and commerce, and the Dutch were loath to see their hard-earned wealth siphoned off to fund Spanish wars and ambitions. The conflict began in earnest when Philip sent the Duke of Alba to crush the growing unrest. Alba's harsh measures, including the execution of prominent Dutch nobles and the imposition of new taxes, only served to inflame the situation. William of Orange, a Dutch nobleman who had become known as the Father of the Fatherland, emerged as the leader of the resistance. Under his guidance, the Dutch utilized a combination of naval warfare, guerrilla tactics, and fortified cities to resist Spanish occupation. The early years of the war saw the Spanish forces holding the upper hand. Their professional army, hardened by years of warfare, initially overwhelmed the Dutch resistance. But the tide began to turn as the Dutch adapted to the realities of prolonged conflict. They leveraged their naval expertise, harassing Spanish supply lines and engaging in privateering. On land, they used their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage, flooding low-lying areas to impede Spanish advances. In 1581, the Dutch took a bold step that would change the course of the war and European history. With the Act of Abjuration, they formally rejected Spanish authority and declared their independence. While this didn't immediately end the conflict, it marked a significant shift in the nature of the struggle. The newly formed Dutch Republic now fought not just as rebels, but as a sovereign state seeking international recognition. As the war dragged on, Spain found itself increasingly stretched thin. Already engaged in conflicts across Europe and the Mediterranean, the Spanish crown struggled to maintain its grip on the Netherlands. The conflict became a drain on Spanish resources, forcing the monarchy into a series of bankruptcies that weakened its position both at home and abroad. The war entered a new phase in 1609 with the signing of the 12 Years' Truce. This temporary cessation of hostilities gave both sides a chance to regroup, but it also demonstrated Spain's inability to quickly suppress the Dutch rebellion. When fighting resumed in 1621, it was clear that the balance of power had shifted. The Dutch Republic, having used the truce to strengthen its economic and military position, was now better equipped to resist Spanish attempts at reconquest. Finally, after 80 years of conflict, the war came to an end with the Treaty of Munster in 1648. Spain, exhausted and facing challenges on multiple fronts, was forced to recognize Dutch independence. The treaty was more than just a peace agreement. It was an acknowledgement of a new reality in Europe. The Spanish Empire, once seemingly invincible, had been forced to concede defeat to a former province. As the 17th century dawned, Spain's vast empire stood at a crossroads. The once invincible superpower that had dominated European affairs for over a century now faced a perfect storm of challenges that would test its very foundations. The Spanish Habsburgs, who had inherited an empire on which the sun never set, found themselves locked in a cycle of constant warfare that would drain their coffers and strain their resources to the breaking point. Throughout this tumultuous period, Spain fought on multiple fronts simultaneously. The empire clashed with France, England, and the newly independent Dutch Republic, while also maintaining costly conflicts in Italy and the Holy Roman Empire. Each battle, each siege, each naval engagement chipped away at Spain's military strength and economic vitality. At the heart of Spain's troubles lay a paradox. The empire's vast American territories, which had once fueled its meteoric rise to power, now contributed to its instability. The flood of silver from mines in Mexico and Peru, which had initially filled Spanish coffers to overflowing, led to rampant inflation across Europe. As silver production began to decline, Spain found itself caught in an economic trap of its own making. The Battle of Rocroi in 1643 marked a turning point in Spain's military fortunes. This devastating defeat at the hands of the French shattered the aura of invincibility that had long surrounded the famed Spanish tercios, the elite infantry units that had dominated European battlefields for over a century. The loss at Rocroi was more than just a military setback. It was a symbolic blow to Spanish prestige and a harbinger of the challenges to come. As Spain struggled to maintain its global commitments, internal issues began to mount. Political corruption seeped into the highest levels of government, while administrative inefficiencies hampered efforts to effectively manage the far-flung empire. Economic stagnation set in, as Spain's reliance on American silver left it ill-equipped to compete with the rising mercantile powers of Northern Europe. The reign of Philip IV, which spanned from 1621 to 1665, saw ambitious attempts at military and fiscal reform. The king and his advisors recognized the need for change if Spain was to maintain its position as a great power. However, the continuous drain of resources made meaningful recovery all but impossible. Each new conflict seemed to undo whatever progress had been made, leaving Spain in an increasingly precarious situation. As the century wore on, Spain's grip on its empire began to loosen. Portugal, which had been united with Spain since 1580, regained its independence in 1640 after a long and costly rebellion. In the Netherlands, decades of conflict had finally forced Spain to acknowledge Dutch independence in 1648. These losses were more than just territorial. They represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power in Europe. By the late 1600s, it was clear that Spain's days as Europe's undisputed superpower were numbered. the Habsburg dynasty, which had presided over Spain's Golden Age, found itself unable to produce a viable heir. As the century drew to a close, the question of Spanish succession loomed large over European affairs, setting the stage for yet another devastating conflict. As Spain's empire reached its zenith in the 16th century, a hidden force was reshaping the very foundations of its power. The discovery of vast deposits of precious metals in the Americas transformed Spain into the wealthiest nation in Europe, but this newfound abundance came at a steep price. The story of Spain's economic plunder in the New World is a tale of greed, innovation, and unintended consequences that would ultimately contribute to the empire's decline. The heart of Spain's American wealth lay in the silver mines of Potosí, high in the Andes Mountains of present-day Bolivia, and Zacatecas in Mexico. These mines produced staggering amounts of silver, fueling Spain's imperial ambitions and reshaping the global economy. The scale of this extraction was unprecedented in human history. At its peak in the late 16th century, Potosí alone accounted for half of the world's silver production. To manage this influx of wealth, Spain established the Casa de Contratación, or House of Trade, in Seville. This institution served as the central clearinghouse for all colonial commerce, ensuring that the riches of the Americas flowed directly into Spanish coffers. The Casa de Contratación regulated trade, collected taxes, and maintained detailed records of every ship, cargo, and passenger that crossed the Atlantic. The transportation of this vast wealth gave rise to one of the most impressive maritime operations of the age, the Spanish treasure fleets. These convoys, known as flotas, sailed annually between Spain and its American colonies, carrying silver, gold, and other valuable commodities. The journey was perilous, with the constant threat of storms, shipwrecks, and piracy. Yet, when successful, these fleets delivered enormous wealth to Spain, making it the envy of Europe. However, the flood of American silver had far-reaching and often unexpected consequences. As the precious metal poured into Europe, it triggered a phenomenon known as the price revolution. The massive increase in the money supply led to severe inflation, with prices in Spain rising as much as 400% over the course of the 16th century. This devaluation of currency weakened Spain's long-term economic stability, even as it appeared to be at the height of its power. The irony of Spain's American wealth was that much of it ended up in foreign hands. The Spanish crown, constantly embroiled in expensive wars across Europe, relied heavily on loans from Italian and German bankers to fund its military campaigns. As a result, a significant portion of the silver extracted from American mines flowed out of Spain almost as quickly as it arrived, enriching Spain's creditors and rivals. To cover its mounting debts, the Spanish crown imposed increasingly heavy taxes on its own citizens. This burden fell particularly hard on the productive sectors of the Spanish economy, leading to economic stagnation and a decline in domestic manufacturing and agriculture. As Spain focused on extracting wealth from its colonies, it neglected to develop a diverse and sustainable economic base at home. The reliance on American silver also had profound effects on Spain's colonies. The demand for labor in the mines led to the exploitation and decimation of indigenous populations. The Spanish introduced the encomienda system, which granted colonists the right to demand tribute and forced labor from native communities. This system, while profitable in the short term, had devastating long-term consequences for the social and economic development of Spain's American territories. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, cast a long shadow over the empire for centuries. While Spain's power grew across the globe, a sinister force worked within its borders to maintain control through fear and religious conformity. The Inquisition, originally created to ensure the orthodoxy of conversos, Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity, soon expanded its reach to touch nearly every aspect of Spanish life. At the heart of the Inquisition were its secretive and highly feared trials. Accused individuals found themselves caught in a web of suspicion, often facing torture to extract confessions. The methods were brutal and varied, from the strappado, where victims were hung by their wrists, to the infamous rack, which slowly stretched the body. These interrogations took place behind closed doors, adding to the terror and mystique surrounding the institution. But the Inquisition's most public face was the auto da fe, or act of faith. These elaborate spectacles were designed to showcase the power of the Church and strike fear into the hearts of potential heretics. Convicted individuals, dressed in sanbenitos, yellow penitential garments, were paraded through the streets before facing their sentences. For many, this meant burning at the stake, a horrific end witnessed by thousands of spectators. The reach of the Inquisition extended far beyond the punishment of individuals. It sought to control the very thoughts and ideas circulating within Spanish society. Books were censored, and intellectual discourse was closely monitored. This stifling atmosphere hindered the spread of Renaissance and Enlightenment ideas in Spain, leaving the country intellectually isolated compared to other European nations. As the centuries passed, the Inquisition's influence began to wane. The 18th century brought Bourbon reforms aimed at modernizing Spain and reducing church control over the state. Yet, the institution persisted, adapting to new perceived threats such as Freemasonry and Enlightenment philosophy. The Inquisition's long-lasting impact on Spanish society cannot be overstated. It created a culture of suspicion and conformity that permeated all levels of society. Neighbors were encouraged to report on one another, leading to a breakdown of trust within communities. The fear of being accused of heresy stifled innovation and free thought, contributing to Spain's eventual decline as a world power. Moreover, the Inquisition's reach extended to Spain's vast colonial empire. In the Americas, it worked to stamp out indigenous religious practices and ensure the orthodoxy of new converts. This added another layer of oppression to the already brutal system of colonial exploitation. The Spanish Inquisition finally met its end in 1834. Abolished as part of Spain's long and painful transition to a modern state. Yet, its legacy lives on in popular imagination and historical memory. The term Inquisition has become synonymous with religious persecution and the abuse of power. The Treaty of the Pyrenees, signed in 1659, marked a pivotal moment in European history, one that would reshape the balance of power on the continent for centuries to come. This agreement between Spain and France wasn't just about ending a war, it was the beginning of Spain's slow descent from its position as Europe's dominant power. The treaty came on the heels of France's victory at the Battle of the Dunes in 1658. This decisive battle demonstrated that Spain's military might, once the envy of Europe, was waning. The Spanish army, which had struck fear into the hearts of its enemies for over a century, now found itself outmatched by the rising French forces. As negotiations began, Spain faced a harsh reality. The country that had once ruled over vast territories across Europe and the Americas now found itself in a position of weakness. The treaty forced Spain to cede key territories to France, including Roussillon, Artois, and parts of the Spanish Netherlands. These losses weren't just about land. They represented a significant reduction in Spain's influence in Western Europe. The treaty also included a provision for the political marriage between Louis XIV of France and Maria Theresa of Spain. This union was meant to strengthen ties between the two rival kingdoms, but it would ultimately set the stage for future conflicts over succession rights. Behind Spain's military defeats lay a deeper problem, one that had been festering for decades. The country's economy, once flush with silver from the Americas, was in decline. Spain's reliance on American silver had led to inflation and economic stability. The country struggled to fund and sustain long wars, a weakness that its enemies were quick to exploit. As Spain's star faded, France's rose. The Treaty of the Pyrenees signaled the ascendancy of France as the new dominant force in Europe. Under the guidance of Cardinal Mazarin and the young Louis XIV, France was expanding its influence and building the foundations of absolute monarchy. The implications of this power shift were far-reaching. Spain, which had once pursued aggressive expansion across Europe, now found itself adopting defensive strategies. The country still held vast territories, including its American colonies, but it was no longer the primary military power of Europe. This decline wasn't just about military might or territorial control. It represented a fundamental shift in how Europe operated. The era of Spanish dominance, which had shaped everything from trade routes to religious conflicts, was coming to an end. In its place, a new order was emerging, one dominated by France and, increasingly, other rising powers like England and the Dutch Republic. The death of King Charles II of Spain in 1700 set off a chain reaction that would shake the foundations of Europe. Charles, the last Habsburg ruler of Spain, left no direct heir, a situation that plunged the continent into chaos. The vacant Spanish throne became the prize in a high-stakes game of royal succession, with two main contenders vying for control over one of the world's most extensive empires. On one side stood Philip of Anjou, grandson of the powerful Louis XIV of France. On the other, Archduke Charles of Austria, backed by those who feared a union between France and Spain would upset the delicate balance of power in Europe. This wasn't just a family squabble. It was a conflict that would draw in nations from across the continent and beyond. The War of Spanish Succession, as it came to be known, erupted in 1701. It wasn't confined to the battlefields of Europe. The conflict spilled over into the Americas and even reached the shores of India. Major powers like England, the Dutch Republic, and Austria formed the Grand Alliance to support the Austrian claim, while France and Spain rallied behind Philip. For 13 years, Europe was engulfed in warfare. Battles raged across the continent, with names like Blenheim, Ramillies, and Malplaquet entering the annals of military history. These weren't just skirmishes. They were massive engagements that saw tens of thousands of soldiers clash in bloody combat. But the war wasn't just fought on foreign soil. Spain itself became a battleground, with different regions supporting different claimants. Castile, the heart of Spain, stood firmly behind Philip. Meanwhile, Catalonia and Aragon, regions with a long history of independence, threw their support behind the Austrian candidate. This internal division turned the conflict into a civil war, tearing at the fabric of Spanish society. As the war dragged on, it became clear that no side could achieve a decisive victory. Exhaustion set in, and the costs of the conflict began to outweigh any potential gains. In 1713, the warring parties finally came to the negotiating table, resulting in the Treaty of Utrecht. The treaty confirmed Philip V as King of Spain, but at a heavy cost. Spain was forced to cede significant territories to Austria and Britain. Gibraltar, a strategic stronghold at the entrance to the Mediterranean, fell into British hands. Naples and the Spanish Netherlands were lost to Austria. These territorial losses marked the beginning of the end for Spain's dominance in Europe. But the Treaty of Utrecht didn't just redraw the map of Europe. It reshaped the economic landscape as well. Britain gained the asiento, the right to supply slaves to Spain's American colonies. This gave the British a foothold in the lucrative Spanish colonial trade, further eroding Spain's economic power. The War of Spanish Succession marked a turning point in European history. It ended the Habsburg dynasty's rule in Spain, ushering in the era of Bourbon monarchy. This change wasn't just a matter of royal lineage, it signaled a shift in Spanish policy. The new Bourbon rulers turned their attention inward, focusing on internal reforms and restructuring their colonial empire. For Spain, the war's aftermath was bittersweet. When Philip V secured the throne, the price of victory was the loss of Spain's position as Europe's dominant power. The once mighty Spanish Empire found itself diminished, its territories reduced, and its influence waning. As the 18th century dawned, Spain found itself at a crossroads. The once mighty empire, still sprawling across the globe, was showing signs of strain. Enter the Bourbon dynasty, a new royal house determined to breathe life into Spain's fading power. But their ambitious reforms would set in motion a series of events that would reshape not just Spain, but the entire world. The Bourbon reforms, initiated in the early 1700s, were a bold attempt to modernize Spain and its vast colonial holdings. Inspired by the centralized governance of France, these reforms aimed to strengthen royal control and streamline the administration of Spain's far-flung territories. It was a massive undertaking, touching every aspect of Spanish rule from the Iberian Peninsula to the Americas and beyond. At the heart of these reforms was a simple yet powerful idea: centralization. The Spanish monarchy sought to consolidate its power, wresting control from local elites and the Catholic Church. This meant reorganizing the colonial territories, creating new viceroyalties to improve governance and tax collection. In 1717, the Viceroyalty of New Granada was established, encompassing much of northern South America. Later, in 1776, the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata was formed, covering vast swaths of southern South America. These administrative changes were more than just lines on a map. They represented a fundamental shift in how Spain viewed and managed its empire. By creating these new administrative units, the Crown hoped to exercise tighter control over its colonies, ensuring a steady flow of wealth back to the mother country. But the Bourbon reforms weren't just about redrawing borders. They also aimed to revitalize Spain's economy and military might. The Spanish Navy, long neglected, received a much-needed overhaul. Key colonial ports were fortified to protect against incursions by rival European powers, particularly the British and Dutch. These improvements were crucial for securing Spain's trade routes and maintaining its grip on its overseas territories. Perhaps one of the most significant economic changes was the promotion of free trade within the empire. For centuries, trade with the Americas had been tightly controlled, funneled through the ports of Seville and Cadiz. The Bourbon reforms broke this monopoly, allowing Spanish-American ports to trade more freely with Spain. This move was intended to stimulate economic growth and increase tax revenues for the Crown. However, these reforms had unintended consequences. As the Crown tightened its grip on the colonies, it weakened the influence of the Creole elite, American-born Spaniards who had long enjoyed considerable power and privilege. This shift in the balance of power sowed the seeds of resentment that would later fuel independence movements across Spanish America. The reforms also targeted the Catholic Church, long a powerful force in Spanish society and colonial administration. In 1767, the Jesuits, a prominent religious order, were expelled from all Spanish territories. This move was part of a broader effort to curb church influence and increase royal authority over education and land holdings. While the Bourbon reforms temporarily strengthened Spain's empire, they also created new tensions between the Crown and its colonial subjects. The centralization of power, while efficient on paper, often clashed with local customs and interests. The increased tax burden on the colonies, meant to fund Spain's military endeavors and modernization efforts, fueled growing discontent. The British Empire, long a thorn in Spain's side, was about to deliver a devastating blow to its rivals' global dominance. In 1762, as the 7 Years' War raged across Europe and its colonies, Britain set its sight on two of Spain's most prized possessions, Havana and Manila. These cities were more than just colonial outposts. They were the linchpins of Spain's vast trading network, connecting the riches of the Americas with the exotic goods of Asia. Havana, the jewel of the Caribbean, was Spain's main naval base in the region. Its harbor, protected by massive stone fortifications, had long been considered impregnable. But the British, emboldened by their successes against France, were determined to prove otherwise. In June 1762, a massive British fleet appeared on the horizon, carrying over 14,000 soldiers and sailors. The siege that followed would last 2 months and test the limits of both sides. The Spanish defenders, led by Juan de Prado, put up a fierce resistance. But they were outgunned and outmaneuvered by the British forces, commanded by the Earl of Albemarle. As the summer heat bore down on the city, disease began to ravage both armies. Yet the British pressed on, relentlessly bombarding the Spanish fortifications until, on August 13th, Havana finally fell. The capture of Havana was a catastrophic blow to Spanish prestige and power. For 11 months, the British occupied the city, opening its trade to their merchants and introducing large numbers of enslaved African laborers. This brief period would have long-lasting consequences for Cuba's economy and society, laying the groundwork for the island's future as a sugar-producing powerhouse. But the British weren't content with just Havana. On the other side of the world, they set their sights on Manila, the capital of the Spanish Philippines. This city was the eastern terminus of the famed Manila galleon trade, the route that had connected Asia to the Americas for nearly 2 centuries. In October 1762, a small British force under the command of William Draper and Samuel Cornish launched a surprise attack on the city. The Spanish defenders, caught off guard and poorly prepared, could only offer token resistance. After a brief battle, Manila fell to the British, disrupting the lucrative trade that had been the lifeblood of Spain's Pacific Empire. The occupation of Manila, while shorter than that of Havana, exposed the vulnerability of Spain's far-flung colonial possessions. These twin defeats were a wake-up call for the Spanish Empire. They revealed glaring weaknesses in Spain's ability to defend its overseas territories from European rivals. The once mighty Spanish Navy, which had struck fear into the hearts of its enemies during the days of the Armada, was now struggling to maintain control over its own trade routes. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 brought an end to the 7 Years' War and saw Britain return both Havana and Manila to Spanish control. But the price was high. Spain was forced to cede Florida to Britain, further weakening its position in the Americas. In exchange, Spain received Louisiana from France, a territory that would prove to be more of a burden than an asset in the years to come. The humiliation of losing Havana and Manila, even temporarily, spurred Spain into action. The Bourbon reforms, already underway, took on new urgency. Spain poured resources into strengthening its colonial defenses, building new fortifications and reorganizing its military forces in the Americas and the Philippines. But these efforts came at a cost, both financial and political, as increased taxation and centralization of power fueled growing discontent among Spain's colonial subjects. The winds of change were blowing across the Spanish Empire, and the storm clouds of revolution were gathering on the horizon. In 1808, a series of events would set in motion a chain reaction that would forever alter the face of the Americas and spell the beginning of the end for Spain's colonial dominion. Napoleon Bonaparte, the ambitious French emperor, had set his sights on the Iberian Peninsula. His invasion of Spain in 1808 sent shockwaves through the empire, creating a power vacuum that would prove impossible to fill. King Ferdinand VII, the Spanish monarch, was forced to abdicate, leaving the colonies in a state of confusion and uncertainty. This crisis of legitimacy sparked a wave of independence movements across Spanish America, as local elites saw an opportunity to seize control of their own destinies. The Creole aristocracy, long frustrated by their second-class status under Spanish rule, began to dream of self-governance. These were men and women of Spanish descent born in the Americas, educated in European ideas, but deeply connected to their native lands. They had watched with interest as the American and French revolutions unfolded, and now they saw a chance to apply those radical ideas to their own circumstances. From this ferment of ideas and ambition emerged a cadre of revolutionary leaders who would change the face of the continent. In the north, Simón Bolívar, a charismatic Venezuelan aristocrat, began to rally support for independence. His vision of a united Gran Colombia encompassing much of northern South America would inspire generations of Latin American patriots. To the south, José de San Martín, an Argentine general with a brilliant military mind, began to forge an army that would liberate much of southern South America. And in Mexico, a humble priest named Miguel Hidalgo raised the banner of revolt, calling for independence and social reform. Spain, still reeling from the Napoleonic invasion and weakened by years of costly wars in Europe, found itself ill-equipped to deal with the growing unrest in its American possessions. The once mighty Spanish military, which had conquered vast swaths of the New World, now faced a series of humiliating defeats at the hands of ragtag revolutionary armies. The Battle of Boyacá in 1819 was a turning point. Bolívar's forces decisively defeated the Spanish, securing independence for what would become Colombia and dealing a severe blow to Spanish prestige. 2 years later, the Battle of Carabobo in 1821 saw Venezuela throw off the yoke of colonial rule. Peru, long a bastion of Spanish power in South America, finally fell after the Battle of Ayacucho in 1824, marking the effective end of Spanish rule on the continent. Mexico, the jewel in the crown of Spain's American empire, declared its independence in 1821 under the leadership of Agustín de Iturbide. The loss of Mexico was a devastating blow to Spanish power and prestige, cutting off a vital source of wealth and influence. Even Brazil, though not a Spanish colony, was caught up in the wave of independence sweeping the continent. In a unique twist of fate, the Portuguese royal family had fled to Brazil to escape Napoleon, inadvertently sowing the seeds of Brazilian independence. In 1822, Brazil peacefully separated from Portugal, becoming an independent empire under Dom Pedro I. By 1833, Spain had lost almost all of its American territories. The empire that had once stretched from California to Tierra del Fuego was reduced to a few Caribbean islands, Cuba and Puerto Rico. These last vestiges of Spanish America would cling to the empire for another 65 years, finally breaking away in the Spanish-American War of 1898. The sun was setting on the Spanish Empire, and the final act of its colonial drama was about to unfold. In 1898, Spain's once mighty overseas territories had dwindled to just a handful of possessions: Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and a few small Pacific islands. These last vestiges of the empire were about to slip through Spain's fingers in a conflict that would reshape the global balance of power. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was the culmination of decades of tension in the Caribbean. Cuba, long under Spanish rule, had been fighting for independence since 1895. The Cuban rebels, led by charismatic figures like José Martí, had captured the imagination of the American public. Newspapers in the United States, particularly those owned by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, fanned the flames of anti-Spanish sentiment with sensationalized stories of Spanish atrocities. The spark that ignited this powder keg came on February 15, 1898, when the USS Maine, an American battleship anchored in Havana Harbor, suddenly exploded. While the cause of the explosion remains a mystery to this day, American newspapers immediately blamed Spain. The rallying cry, "Remember the Main," spread across the United States, and war became inevitable. Spain, once the most formidable naval power in the world, found itself woefully unprepared for conflict with the rising industrial giant of the United States. The Spanish Navy, which had struck fear into the hearts of its enemies for centuries, was now a shadow of its former self. Many of its ships were outdated, and its sailors were poorly trained and equipped. The war began in earnest on May 1, 1898, with the Battle of Manila Bay in the Philippines. Commodore George Dewey's American Asiatic Squadron decimated the Spanish fleet, sinking or capturing every Spanish ship without losing a single American vessel. This lopsided victory effectively ended Spanish control over the Philippines and demonstrated the stark difference in naval capabilities between the two nations. The conflict in the Caribbean was equally disastrous for Spain. On July 3rd, the Spanish Caribbean fleet attempted to break out of Santiago Harbor in Cuba, only to be destroyed by the U.S. Navy in a matter of hours. With their naval forces in tatters, the Spanish ground troops in Cuba and Puerto Rico were isolated and unable to receive reinforcements or supplies. The war, which had begun with such fanfare, ended in just 10 weeks. Spain, recognizing the futility of further resistance, sued for peace. The Treaty of Paris, signed on December 10, 1898, formalized the end of the Spanish Empire in the Americas and the Pacific. Spain ceded Cuba, which became nominally independent under U.S. influence, Puerto Rico, and Guam to the United States. The Philippines were also transferred to American control for a payment of $20 million. For Spain, the loss of these territories marked the end of an empire that had lasted for over 4 centuries. The country that had once dominated vast swaths of the globe was now reduced to a second-tier European power. The psychological impact on the Spanish national psyche was profound, giving rise to a generation of thinkers and writers known as the Generation of '98, who grappled with questions of national identity and modernization in the wake of imperial collapse. For the United States, the war marked its emergence as a global power. Almost overnight, America had acquired an overseas empire, complete with naval bases that would project American power across the Pacific and the Caribbean. This newfound status would have far-reaching consequences for American foreign policy in the 20th century and beyond. The fate of the former Spanish colonies varied. Cuba gained independence, but under the terms of the Platt Amendment, the United States retained the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. Puerto Rico became an unincorporated territory of the United States, a status it retains to this day. The Philippines, after a bloody war of resistance against American rule, would not gain full independence until 1946. The Spanish Empire's influence didn't disappear with the setting sun of its colonial rule. Instead, it left an indelible mark on the world, shaping cultures, languages, and societies across continents. Today, we see the legacy of this once mighty empire in ways both obvious and subtle, from the bustling streets of Mexico City to the grand cathedrals of Manila. Let's start with language. Spanish, once the tongue of conquistadors and viceroys, has become the second most spoken language in the world. Over 500 million people across the globe communicate in Spanish, making it a linguistic powerhouse that spans continents. From the Andes to Andalusia, from California to Colombia, Spanish unites diverse peoples and cultures, carrying with it centuries of history and tradition. But the empire's impact goes far beyond words. The legal and administrative systems of many former Spanish colonies bear the unmistakable imprint of Spanish governance. Concepts like civil law, municipal governance, and land tenure systems, introduced during colonial times, continue to shape how societies function in Latin America and beyond. This legal legacy has profound implications for everything from property rights to judicial processes in these nations. Religion, too, stands as a testament to Spain's enduring influence. Catholicism, brought to the New World by zealous missionaries and conquistadors, remains the dominant faith in most former Spanish territories. The towering cathedrals of Lima and Bogotá, the vibrant religious festivals of the Philippines, and the deep-rooted traditions of Mexico's Day of the Dead all speak to the lasting impact of Spanish Catholicism on global culture. In the realm of art and literature, Spain's golden age continues to shine. The works of Miguel de Cervantes, with his ingenious gentleman Don Quixote, still captivate readers worldwide. The bold brushstrokes of Pablo Picasso, deeply influenced by his Spanish heritage, revolutionized modern art. These cultural touchstones, born from Spain's imperial era, continue to inspire and influence creators across the globe. However, the legacy of the Spanish Empire is not without controversy. The dark shadows of colonization, forced labor, and indigenous oppression linger in historical memory. Debates rage on how to reconcile the achievements of the empire with the human cost of its expansion. This complex legacy challenges us to grapple with difficult questions about power, culture, and historical responsibility. The economic structures established during colonial rule have had lasting effects on the nations that emerged from the empire. Plantation economies, resource extraction models, and trade patterns set up centuries ago continue to influence the economic realities of Latin America and the Philippines. Understanding these historical economic relationships helps explain current global economic dynamics and inequalities. Perhaps most intriguingly, the Spanish Empire's legacy lives on in the very fabric of modern national identities. The cultures that emerged from the collision of Spanish and indigenous traditions are unique and vibrant, blending European and American elements in ways that continue to evolve. As we reach the end of our journey through the rise and fall of the Spanish Empire, we're left with a profound sense of its lasting impact on our world. The legacy of Spain's global dominance continues to shape our lives in ways both obvious and subtle. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more captivating history documentaries. Let us know in the comments which part of this documentary fascinated you the most. Thank you for watching and joining us on this journey through the past. We'll see you in the next documentary.